the Project for Study of the 21st Century. I am also, as of last Tuesday, Reuters' new global affairs columnist. I'm back on the books after a year and a bit sabbatical. I'm a career Reuters journalist. I joined Reuters in 2003, tours overseas in Southern Africa, Sri Lanka, where I broke my neck, for those who were wondering the answer to that fairly obvious question. And the last year and a half, I've been running PS21, the world's cheapest think tank, now running in DC, New York, and London. We've done about 65 events in the last year in those three cities. It's gone quite well. We're joined today by a really excellent panel to discuss the perennial sea of storms that is Europe. We've got Sir Michael Leigh, probably the most Europeanized Brit that we've ever had. Sir Michael Leigh, knight of the realm, no less. Now senior advisor of the German Marshal Fund, was a European Commission official for 25 years plus, more than 25 years. Deputy Commissioner for EU Enlargement, Director General for EU Enlargement, Deputy Director General for EU Foreign Relations for the Commission. Heather Conley, now essentially head of the Europe program at CSIS, former official looking at Europe at defence primarily, right? The State Department. One of the foremost Europe experts in town and the token American on the panel. And Simona, head of the Future Europe program at Atlantic Council.
Not a head, but managing Europe program.
The one who actually does the work. A Slovak national, token mainland European, and an expert in all things European. I want to keep this conversation as broad as we can, because it strikes me a lot of the discussions that take place on this end up being very siloed. The question is, what do we do about Russia? What do we do about migrants? What would Brexit mean? And it strikes me that they are all very much part of the same turgid crisis. I know a couple of you here were here at our What's Happening with the Syria Civil War discussion a week and a bit ago, which is also part of the same crisis. The general conclusion of that discussion, for what it's worth, as it does feed into this, was that a lot of Syrians seem to feel that war is not going to be over anytime soon, that the great powers are not going to sort it out, and therefore it makes perfect sense to try and move themselves and their family to somewhere which is marginally less screwed up, which, if you're Syrian, is Europe. Michael, of all of these crises, which feels like the most systemic to you, and why?
I think the most systemic is the continuing Eurozone crisis. Crisis usually implies something short, sharp, acute, requiring an urgent decision. So none of these crises really are crises in that sense, but ongoing condition. I think the really solid governance structures for the Eurozone have not yet been put in place. We're kind of in a condition of remission right now, which should not be mistaken for having overcome the problems. There may be a looming deadline in July when Greece has to make a major repayment to its creditors. Greece may well be found, as a result of the next thorough check on its performance, to be off track with quite a few of the commitments. The European Commission is about to publish its assessment of debt sustainability. It's going to find that 11 EU countries have problems, potentially at least, with debt sustainability. In a sense, I think this is one of the deepest underlying crises. Two of the core members of the Eurozone, France and Germany, have yet to agree really on the fundamentals of Eurozone governance and on the principle of debt sharing. So although the refugee crisis is not to be minimized and the impact on Schengen is considerable, the future of Schengen is very uncertain at this point. If you ask a question about sort of structural issues of a long-term nature, I would say the Eurozone still remains a subject of great concern.
Heather, from Washington's perspective, when you mention Europe, it tends to all come down to Russia. That seems to be I certainly remember during 2012, the Obama administration put a hell of a lot of effort, quite quietly, into not fixing the Eurozone, but getting it through the year. And quite a lot of people will tell you that without that, it might have been even messier than it was. The new kind of crisis du jour from Washington's perspective seems to be Russia, right?
Absolutely. Mr. Putin has a way of sometimes helping us. 6 months before the Newport NATO summit, NATO was searching for its role 15 years after Afghanistan, wasn't quite sure what it was going to be, and then sadly the illegal annexation of Crimea, the invasion of eastern Ukraine focused our minds like a laser beam. In some ways it played to our instinct. This is where in the security realm we know how to act, we know what to do, and we just didn't have the muscle memory of doing it. And I think everyone was surprised as the crisis began unfolding. The White House did not take 9 weeks to evaluate the pros and the cons of sending additional U.S. forces to the 3 Baltic states and Poland. They immediately responded to that, and really to this day are now strengthening or recommending quadrupling of U.S. defense spending in Europe, sort of a return to Europe. But it's only in that sort of narrow pillar in some ways. And what Michael was pointing to, this crisis that Europe is facing, I often think of Jean Monnet saying, crisis is how Europe will evolve. I don't think he had any understanding of the trifecta of crises between the Eurozone crisis, the migration crisis, the security crisis that Russia is challenging, that all of a sudden Europeans that were thinking that they were in a postmodern society where how could anyone interpret trade with Ukraine as an act of war? How could that soft power be interpreted as anything other than something positive? And now great powers have returned, have crossed borders. People are weapons. General Breedlove said this migration crisis is the weaponization of immigration.
But by that, did he mean people were doing it deliberately? And if so, who did he mean?
I think he was speaking to President Putin.
The idea that by destabilizing Syria, you're creating a tidal wave of people into Europe that destabilizes it.
Weakening Europe, weakening the West. And I'll just stop here. I think in some ways the broader trends we're seeing, this is a real crisis of confidence in the West, Western institutions, and Western resolve to enforce its rules, its norms. We talk about norms in international law, whether that's in Asia, trading norms, or maritime norms in the South China Sea. We talk about norms in the European humanitarian law in Syria. These are wonderful ideas, but who is there to enforce them? And then the U.S. is having a crisis of confidence whether it wants to play the global enforcer role that it has played in the past.
I mean, it strikes me that when I joined Reuters in 2003, Europe was a place where you went if you wanted to write about bond yields and the structural building of the Eurozone, which turned out to be a lot more interesting and less well done than everyone seemed to assume at the time. It strikes me history is not done with Europe yet. I have no idea what happens next, but it's probably going to be interesting. I mean, Simona, you're from a country that didn't exist when you were born. Europe is a place where the realities of which states existed have historically been in massive flux. In a way, it's kind of hard to understand if you're British or American.
Yeah.
I mean, how unpredictable do you feel the next kind of decade and a half, 2 decades are in Europe?
Oh, I think it's actually tremendously unpredictable because honestly, if you look at even 2 years ago, no one would have predicted this. I mean, we all thought that Russia is going to be the biggest problem, and it was correctly identified as the sort of biggest threat to the stability of Europe and security as well. But little did we know what is going to actually unfold. And I think the idea that migration flows or sort of humanitarian refugee crisis can put the idea of Europe as we know it to the test was definitely something that I think they, not even Monet or, his contemporaries right now would have expected. And what I actually mean by that migration crisis is actually identity crisis of Europe. And it's because it actually fully exposed the fissures and cracks that have been unfolding in many countries, including my own country, because we just didn't sort of feel the European values the way they were almost imposed to us, how some people in Slovakia actually feel about it.
What do you mean by European values?
So when you think about what are the core principles of this sort of European project, is European solidarity, it's a sort of Europe's unity, and it's a trust and confidence into Europe as a mechanism that will bring prosperity, stability, and peace to its people. However, all of these were broken apart and they were eroded. And it actually started, I feel like the migration crisis, it's like a perfect example where all of these are just being magnified. But it started actually much earlier than that. Europe's solidarity was eroded during the first Greek bailout, when obviously some countries needed to pay for big steps, some countries needed to adopt austerity measures. Europe's unity was highly eroded 2 years ago when we were faced with Russia and needed to deal with that. And even though we came together with sanctions and some agreements, but the sort of negative rhetoric, pro-Russian rhetoric, sometimes anti-Western rhetoric, coming from countries like Slovakia or Hungary or Czech Republic was very harmful and opened doors for almost ideological exploitation from Russia when we were they were providing an alternative to precisely what Hannah was talking about, to our liberal international order that we've created, and they were sort of providing an alternative that somehow seems to be appealing to the people. Because when you think about what the European project has brought, one of the two greatest achievements is the Eurozone and it's the Schengen. And when you look at what European people think, and I think that this is the fundamental problem that sometimes politicians do not consider, is that they don't feel that Eurozone has brought them prosperity or jobs, and they feel now Schengen is threatening their cultural identity because of the.
I mean, to be fair, the European project has achieved, 2, 3 generations free from European war, which, is a massive achievement in European diplomatic terms. But I also want to come back to Michael. A lot of this is about the domestic politics in a bunch of countries, right? And in pretty much all countries in the bloc, the domestic politics are messy at best.
Yeah, there's a school of thought that claims that what we're seeing now is a new division between a socially liberal West and potentially authoritarian East. This is something that I think
the
is...
East as defined by the former Warsaw Pact countries.
Exactly. Poland, Slovakia, Hungary, other countries which are members of the European
Union. Countries that are
Union.
turning to authoritarianism, but not Russian domination necessarily.
Yes. I think, alas, this is an oversimplification. As you look at the domestic politics of many European countries, first of all, I think we do need to show some understanding to the countries in Central Europe, which could not really have been expected to complete their political transition in half a generation. We know from experience it takes longer than that. And what we're seeing now, I think, is not a wholesale rejection of European values. It took a long time in the country that I know best, the United Kingdom and France and elsewhere, really to absorb these European values. You may remember.
And we may not have absorbed enough to stop us leaving in the next 3 months.
Absolutely. But even the fundamentals concerning rule of law, human rights, respect for others. When I was growing up in the UK, what you could hear on comedy programs on the radio concerning various minority groups, I just wish to put into perspective our concern about the East. We've been at it in the UK since Magna Carta in 1215. It's only to be expected that this is going to take a while. But also, I think this vision of Europe divided between sort of socially liberal West and a potentially authoritarian East is misleading, because we see the same trends in Western Europe.
And possibly North America.
Well, here we are in the middle of an election campaign, and maybe Heather had some thoughts about that. But populism in general, I think, is a response to the fact that we've had low growth, tepid growth, recession for a very long time. Median incomes haven't moved, whether in the US or the UK. People, even if their economies are doing relatively well, as in the UK or the US, are simply not feeling the benefit. And they're beginning to feel that government simply can't deliver to them what they expect.
And this is slightly unfair. If you look at Slovakia, we've seen a massive improvement in living standards in a generation. If you look at me, I, as mentioned earlier, paralyzed with the shoulders down, British welfare state kept me going for a decade. That would, I could never have existed on any other continent in any other decade of human history ever. There are not, as you know, as many Americans like me. They stay at home and they destroy the lives of their closest female relatives. It's, Europe has actually been a remarkably generous system, which may explain why 1 million people a year are now turning up in it. It's been in so many ways hugely successful, but that doesn't mean it's sustainable.
And I think, Michael, you're pulling on something. It's less to do with the East-West divide. I think Marine Le Pen had it right. This is patriots versus globalists. This is the section that was influencing all of us, from the U.S. presidential elections to Europe, even a growing middle class in China and India, we are all confronted by rapid change, economic change, social change, and there's two responses and reactions to that change. Open up the infrastructure, education system, embrace the globalization, global supply chains, be the best in that system. Or by golly, you're going to hunker down, you're going to protect, you're going to fill the walls, you're going to be nationalistic, chauvinistic in ways, and that's how you protect from these massive ways of globalization that have upset our economic understanding, our identity, our culture, and brought all of this and amplified it through social media. So Marine Le Pen and a Jobbik in Hungary, they have similarities.
Or a Putin in Russia.
Or Putin in Russia. And I think you're absolutely right. There are now becoming alternative leadership models in this chaos of globalization. There's managed democracy, there's authoritarianism. China is sort of a capitalist, but a draconian democratic system or a forced system. We're all struggling in dealing with this. So I think it's less Central Europe than Western Europe. Ireland's having trouble forming a government. Spain can't form a government. We're going to watch Slovakia try to form a government. When there is a majority government in Poland and Hungary, we see abuse of a majority system to change the nature of those democracies. So I think what we're seeing is quite profound, not so much East and West.
Absolutely.
If I might just pick up on that, because I think it's what Heather is sort of alluding to is this notion of political paralysis that we're sort of experiences across Europe. And in the case of Slovakia, we just had elections this weekend, and everyone sort of expected that our sort of slightly authoritarian, a prime minister with authoritarian style of government is going to actually win a majority again, or maybe form a coalition with one more party. But what has actually happened is that far right has gained in Slovakia, has gained ground, and two far right parties got into the government, which hasn't happened in 20
and this is where European systems are interesting, right? I mean, I've got a column coming up hopefully this week suggesting that actually, say what you like about President Trump, this system is so bloody hard for the President of the United States to operate in that there's actually quite a limit to what he can do. In a European more pluralist model, as we saw in the 1930s, you don't need to win the election to end up with enough control over the political system to be able to achieve quite a lot, right? And that's true in quite a number of countries.
Fortunately, if you win the election, you won't be in government. Yeah, I mean, that would be true if it were the case, but I feel like now we're facing a political situation in some of those countries where the mainstream parties or centrist parties are losing, but the alternative is not yet strong enough. So, what's unfolding in Spain, Portugal, or Ireland is sort of the response of people who are disappointed with some of the austerity measures, and what's happening in sort of Central Europe is sort of dissatisfaction with the sort of Western values and almost mystifying EU and NATO. So you have almost two different streams of developments that are happening, but with the same effect, that basically these countries are not going to have functioning governments in a while, and if they do, they may have a caretaker governments or lead into early elections in some of these countries, which I think it's going to happen in Slovakia as well.
But the election itself doesn't necessarily bring more clarity, right?
That's exactly right.
I mean, if we look at the way the Eurozone crisis has been managed since 2009, it's generally involved getting all the government heads into a room and then having them agree a decision between them that their electorates are all distinctly skeptical about for a variety of different reasons. That gets harder and harder in this environment.
It does, and that was part of the old style of European decision-making, in which a bunch of wise people get together in a room, take a decision top-down, and then wait for the benefits to flow and for people to buy into the decision subsequently. It worked like that for many decades, in fact. The population was not consulted through referenda on some of the most decisive steps towards European integration in the past. But that old model just doesn't work anymore. And people are ready to question the EU at every stage. Another thing that's exacerbated this, I think, is that political parties like the National Front in France and some of the other extremist parties in other member states, if you look at the base of these parties and the attitudes of militants, they're pretty unhealthy. They're based on xenophobia, racism, in some cases anti-Semitism. And what some of these parties have understood is that if they want to be elected, they have to take some distance from these toxic elements. So they try to detoxify themselves by becoming anti-EU, because this somehow is a legitimate position to take, whereas racism and xenophobia, they've just about understood, is not publicly acceptable everywhere.
It's not publicly acceptable now, but I mean, I wonder if, you know, the addition of 1 million new people a year starts making more sense. And one of the lessons of Donald Trump is that actually, if you say the unacceptable in popular parlance, you don't necessarily render yourself as toxic as you think. I mean, that actually being the guy who talks common sense, you know, in the view of a bunch of people on the streets, can get you quite a long way.
Well, we may be undergoing a change, and it may come in Europe too, because the conventional wisdom is to get elected in any of our countries, we need to move towards the center. And traditionally, the swing votes were in the center, and that's where you played for power. This may be changing, and as Simone said, with the fractioning of political systems, 4 or 5 parties in play in Slovakia and elsewhere, this old rule of thumb doesn't seem to apply anymore.
But how does this play in terms of US-Europe policy? Is the messier, I mean, if it's a free Europe against the Russians, I think America knows where it stands, right? At least a lot of America does. If it's Europe is a messy bunch of quite, you know, potentially unpleasant governments who can't get on, and you know, and then need America to come and put the roof back on, that plays much more to the sort of, you know, isolationist sentiments, right?
Yeah, I mean, Europe is, for U.S. policy, you have to see Europe as a long-term, very worthwhile investment. And you have to roll up your sleeves and get very involved in how Europe makes its policies, its institutions, its economics. If you don't believe in that return of investment, you won't invest. And then you'll be very transactional, and you'll ask for things when you're needing them, and you'll turn around and you'll be very surprised when elections happen and referendums happen. You go, oh my goodness, what is going on? What is happening to you? But I need you to respond to X, Y, and Z. So in part, we have, you know, I think mentally, when 9/11 moved us intellectually out of Europe, we were there during the Bosnia conflict, the Kosovo conflict. We moved to Afghanistan, to Iraq. Europe was there to support U.S. interests. It was a very divisive, obviously, period, which did not help. And then when President Obama came to office, he moved towards Asia. Europe was a backdrop where you held important conversations about Iran nuclear agreements and working on the bigger global challenges like climate change, but you weren't working in Europe. Secretary Kerry wasn't visiting Paris to work on Paris's internal dynamics or European dynamics. He was working on others.
You also saw the son of, I mean, you know, when I was here in 2012, Europe was a treasury problem. So, you know, it was high on the treasury's list, and it was a place that Kerry went for conferences, and the Secretary of Defense would go for, you know, for resources.
But that's right. You know, the economic crisis, and it's very hard, in my view, was a political crisis. It was a concept that was half-baked, and it needed to be completed, and giving it to the Treasury Department, as smart as that was, that wasn't about the politics of Europe. That was Treasury secretaries repeatedly telling German finance ministers that they had to write a big check and make the crisis go away, not understanding the, you know, decades of clashes on this exact issue and how it was transforming Europe politically and socially. Without that understanding, you can talk until you're blue, and you know the crisis will continue. I think President Obama was struck. It was when the French led the G20, I think, or he came in the middle of this, and he was literally trying to negotiate to get through, you know, to get the Greeks onto the next crisis. I think that was his lesson in how challenging.
But that model gets a lot harder when people can just say, "Look, I can't do that. If I do that, I'll be out of office tomorrow." Which is what a growing number of these leaders are going to have to say to him, right? I mean, you know, the Greeks, the Germans in particular, have been able to tide things over up to a point, decreasingly, particularly in the case of the Greeks, but it will increasingly be the case that someone like Merkel, or whoever replaces her, will just have to say to the president over there, I cannot deliver that, because even if I sign it off, I'll be out of office tomorrow and my successor won't be able to deliver it. That's much harder for Washington, however it works, right?
It is, and I think we've taken Europe for granted so much, we just assume Europe will be there. And I think that assumption, as you're suggesting, as all of us are suggesting, the tectonic plates are really shifting in Europe. I'm a big anniversary nut, so I'm looking at next year's 70th anniversary of the Marshal Plan, the Truman Doctrine. This is when intellectually the United States was thinking big ideas, even though exhausted from war, being pushed in Asia, the Middle East. We could do those big things. I feel like today we don't have the leadership nor the vision to do big things anymore. It's required.
If we get it wrong, July is the 100th anniversary of the Battle of the Somme.
There you go.
And
the trenches are dug in the Donbass. If you want to see reflections of the First World War, you just...
No, but I suppose, the nightmare scenario, we all know what the nightmare scenario is in Russia, but a slightly less nightmarish nightmare scenario would be, a new Western/Eastern front running from the Donetsk front to the Baltic states, slightly militarized, slightly messy, slightly lethal, extremely dangerous, right? And even that's probably, you could argue the reason that probably won't happen is because Europe is too messy to sustain a conflict that well organized. Because everything in the rear areas is falling apart as well. What kind of worries you most of all of these competing, swirling things?
So I come back to that, but I would like to follow up on the sort of transatlantic perspective as well, because just as Peter sort of pointed out that now there's no leadership on the US side, but I think what is even more problematic than on the European side, it's not guaranteed that American leadership will be welcomed. And I think that's part of the bigger challenge, because we've seen Europe and United States grown apart for many reasons, and not just on sort of security, but we've seen challenges about the NSA spying scandal. We've seen different approaches and how they perceive economy and trade, and especially right now with sort of technology, innovation, digital agenda. So I think that there are lots of potential divising points, and that in a way might be most worrying too, because if you ask me, what is the sort of biggest challenge, and what worries me the most, is basically the fact that United States doesn't understand Europe for what it is, and Europe sort of not necessarily will be able to handle with its own challenges and not welcoming the United States at all. So it's almost an erosion of the greatest alliance in the world.
It's also supposed to be an erosion of mutual interest. It's almost certainly in America's interest for Europe to take shed loads of refugees and just manage it, and everyone to put up with it because that's the best thing for it. It's in Europe. It's in America's interest for the Eurozone to work, even if everyone hates it. But that's not necessarily how the population of Europe sees it. By the same token, America may be more energy independent. A Trump presidency would be quite isolationist. I'm not sure a Clinton presidency would be massively, keen on huge engagement. And as you said, there's not necessarily that much interest anyway.
And on that point, and how the population sees it, I think it was said earlier today that it is because of Eurozone and of sort of the achievements that the United States brought to some of these countries, that the prosperity has risen. But unfortunately, it's not being felt in the region. What essentially happened, and for people, some of you may have traveled to the region, people who actually were able to benefit from those opportunities left. And people who stayed, they're basically, there's this phenomena what happened that when the borders opened and when the globalization started poured in, and Western companies, that sort of the wages stayed at the same level and the prices have risen. So actually, if you go to the people, talk to people in the region, which is why Central Europe has the political leadership that it has right now, it's huge dissatisfaction because they don't see those benefits, and they don't see benefits of the United States dragging us into wars, because that's the
how it's seen, right? Rather than being the protective hand, which is maybe the way it would have been seen 25 years ago. Let's come to Brexit, which I guess in some ways is a smaller version of the same thing. America may or may not want to be involved in Europe. Britain, which has always been a bit different, it's kind of not in Europe, it's 26 miles away. It has always been torn as to whether it wants to be part of what's going on the mainland or not. And for the first time, is deciding. Firstly, what's your conclusion on what's probably going to happen, and more importantly, how it matters?
Well, I think I'm a born optimist or conservative, if you will, on these issues. And I think the British people are probably more conservative than one generally thinks. And
by conservative, you mean conservative, not right-wing?
No, I mean conservative with a small c, and being skeptical about radical change. So I think when they get into the privacy of the voting booth, they'll think about, first of all, how they feel now. And they're not doing too badly, all things considered, in the UK. 5% unemployment, 3% growth, problems with median income, low pay, a lot of issues there. But nonetheless,
some of which are associated with migrants in the European Union.
Some are, but in people's minds they are. But broadly speaking, I think they're not doing too badly. Secondly, those in favor of leaving have never put forward a clear vision of their alternative. They vaguely hint that the emerging economies could be an alternative for Britain. And then you have President Xi of China coming along to say, please stay within the European Union. President Obama is going to visit the UK, I think, before the referendum, and will say the same thing.
But I'm not sure. I wonder whether that will have. I mean, because we have, you said, the rise of globalists versus patriots. I mean, I'm not sure that the Chinese premier standing up in central London and demanding that the United Kingdom stay in the in the EU necessarily achieves anything other than getting a handful of people's backs up in the wrong direction. I'm not sure that President Obama is slightly more, but not that different.
But I think it accentuates the leap in the dark aspect. You're true. All foreign friends of Britain remaining in the EU ask themselves the question, will this be helpful or not? And they take their cue from London. But I think the idea that the Norwegian Minister for Europe said, for example, don't take our model. You know, it just doesn't work. So people won't know what to expect. They don't, and therefore it will be a kind of leap in the dark. Plus the question mark over the future of the UK and the reaction in Scotland. So, I mean, I would like to think that when they come to cast their vote, they will be influenced by these factors. Maybe it's the right deed for the wrong reason. But there's many a slip between here and there, and of course there can be other influences.
I think that, certainly from talking to people back in the UK, if we leave the EU, we may have broken our own country, is a pretty significant thing. You know, if you are English, most people in the UK are English, the idea of Scotland leaving is really quite scary because we don't really know how we'd be able to work as a country on our own. And the idea that you might literally break your own country in half by leaving the EU is an issue. The other issue, I think, which I think is even Boris Johnson kind of alluded to in his "We Should Leave" article, is that the more screwed Europe is, possibly the more damage Britain does by starting to rip up the EU model with the next year. That if Europe's going to fall apart, we don't necessarily want to give the first or last kick. I mean, how would it be seen in Central Europe if the Brits did decide to wander off?
Well, I mean, Czech Prime Minister has already made a point that they may want to open the same discussion in the Czech Republic. So Czech Republic is not part of the Eurozone, so they
whereas Slovakia is, right? It's had a very big relationship with us.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, in Slovakia, I think the sentiments would be definitely different. But I can totally see how you can how leaders, especially how it's playing out in the region, are going to start questioning alliances, and the more opt-outs there are going to be, the more provisions. I think that people are going to start demanding more of that too, and asking questions. Well, why do we need to go through with the EU regulations when it's not benefiting our people too? So
even if we stay in, I suppose we may have, by reopening the negotiation and also doing this sort of slightly Russian roulette, saying we renegotiate or leave, we may already have kind of opened the door to a bunch of other countries doing the same kind of thing.
At the same time, the concessions that Cameron won were so modest that if other countries base themselves on that, they can probably get a similar deal. I mean, if some of the other countries...
Which would be not a very different deal at all.
Indeed, wait for 3 or 4 years before extending full welfare benefits, etc. Maybe an opt-out from ever closer union would be more existential in nature, but it wouldn't in itself, I think, lead to an unraveling if there were 1 or 2 similar demands to those that Cameron had sought. But if it became more generalized, and especially if the UK left, and this then created a model for others, then I think it would be far more disruptive.
I want to come to Heather in a second, but I mean, one of the things that John Oliver, the British comedian, wrote in The Guardian, it's almost impossible to explain the EU referendum to Americans. because because you have to understand the nature of the EU, and that it's not the same as the euro. I've always I think the British people would now vote to leave the euro at all costs that came with it if they were in it. And I think this would actually, I think this would be a kind of last safe moment to get out, with massive costs. But I think there would be an awareness that otherwise they would be locked into a continent they don't necessarily want to be that locked into. The EU and the euro are not the same thing, but of course with Slovakia they are. I remember interviewing your Prime Minister 3 or 4 years ago during one of the earlier Greek bailouts. Slovakia, massive, member of the euro essentially being forced to bail out a country of people where benefits are way more generous than they are in Slovakia. Very, very unhappy about it. I mean, she was trying the Cameron Act up to a point. You sort of, maybe we should just break the whole damn thing. But it's very difficult to do that, right? And that makes people feel very disenfranchised.
Right. But on the other hand, when you put it from a different perspective, I wonder, if Britain indeed leaves, what's going to happen to all the Central European workers that are in the UK? So I think that now, if you ask sort of in Central Europe about the Brexit, I think it's definitely something that they're against, because they sort of understand that single market and free movement of people and goods and services is definitely something that we just do not know how it's going to play out. And part of the sort of concessions that Cameron got was to sort of curb benefits to some of the immigrant workers.
But by the same token, the reason I'm around now is that we could never have funded the care of people like me if we hadn't had the migrants. The migrants, sorry, Anna, she's lovely, but also by the same token, I mean, again, you also have the end of the financial aid to offer these immigrants including benefits. And I was saying to these girls this morning, I'm lucky I got a settlement from my employer so I can look after myself. This is the first year they came to me and said, we can no longer afford you to have 2 carers. That means you can no longer travel, you can no longer choose when you get out. As the door kind of closes on the benefits growing ever more, particularly when another 1 million people turn up and you need to be fed, you end up in some really messy models. I mean, you cannot have unrestricted migration into the EU and the social democratic model of lots of benefits. They just don't work, right? I mean, the whole, the strains on this model are pretty horrific.
There are such strains, but I'm not sure that they mostly come from migrant workers. As you know, in Britain, there was for some time the myth of welfare tourism. There was even an extensive study conducted by the government that was not published in the event, because it did not confirm the fact that many.
No, but I'm making the opposite point. We could never expand the welfare state in the way we did after Blair without the European migration to be able to do it. I mean, we
tax contribution.
No, but not just that, but also the labour to do it. Yeah. People to watch people like me. I mean, this is of all the areas of the world I really, really, really understand. This is one of them, and believe me, that was absolutely vital in the 80s and the 90s. People like me were stuck in nursing homes all the time. There are a variety of reasons that we were able to fix that, including spending a lot more money, but a huge chunk of it was suddenly opening up a massively new labour pool in the early part of the 21st century. I mean, where does the US stand on Brexit? I mean, it's for you, it's kind of just a terrible idea whether it's good for us or not, right?
Well, I mean, it's one heck of a gamble to try to quell a backbench rebellion and take a little starch out of UKIP. I mean, I think to me, I look at it as probably one of the most reckless acts that not only will profoundly change Europe, but will change the transatlantic relationship. It could set off a global economic shock. Only
if it happens, or to an extent anyway.
Well, if the Leave vote happens, but I sort of take your point. I think the political energies have already been released. And we're seeing that in the referendum-itis that is now, in some ways it's curing the democracy deficit, right? But now we're having, everyone wants their own referendum, everyone wants their own say on everything. If it's the Danes for a Justice and Home Affairs opt-out, if it's, the next EU country that I need to give my
if it's a right not to take refugees, which is the risky one, right? I mean, someone like
Orban has already said I'm going to have a so this is unleashed across Europe, and again the political energies, and you both know this better than I do. I watch it from afar. If I learned one thing from the Scottish referendum was indeed political energies, once they are they're formed and they're given reason, they have to go someplace even after the decision is reached. I see a leadership challenge within the Conservative Party that will not be immediately mended post-June 23rd. I see where, you know, the Scottish question was not answered 2 years ago for another. It is very much back on the plate. So these energies, even if the decision to remain stays, the ripple effects from this one act will continue to flow. And for the US, what this means is the UK takes itself out of being globally active until it is resolved. And this started back in January 2013 when Cameron first proposed this very idea.
In defense of Cameron, I mean, I think that's kind of part of the idea, right? Is that we take ourselves out of it until it's resolved, which is June. And then that's and anyway, this is but you're right, that doesn't mean that there won't be another referendum 5 years down the line, just as there might be in Scotland.
Yeah, Heather and I were at a discussion where a very prominent British spokesperson said that this will resolve the matter for a generation, referring back to the earlier.
When the Scottish referendum didn't resolve it until like Christmas. I mean, it's.
But still, I think one of the striking features of the last few years has been Britain's absence from most diplomatic and political challenges that Europe has faced. In particular, Ukraine and the astonishing absence of the UK from the contact group leading to the Minsk Protocol and so on. And it struck me that for Cameron, probably anything which directly or indirectly carried the label Europe looked to him too risky. Now, the hope would be that Britain would resume its more traditional role after the 23rd of June if the referendum turns out to be in favor of remaining. Let's see. I believe this one is.
Does anyone in Europe really care what Britain does? I mean, we get, you know, all Brits get massively obsessed with the idea that, and Americans do as well, which is very sweet, with the idea that, you know, Britain being absent from the world is something that makes any difference to the rest of the world. I mean, does it really matter from the perspective of all of mainland Europe, which I'm now using you to represent?
I think it hugely matters. I think that this is so dangerous because we've talked about political forces across the continent and or in Central Europe in particular. And you know, British, if the vote to leave the Union is going to be successful, then that's a reason to all of these politicians to come to their people and tell them, this is not working. And it's that good. After that, I think it's tremendously dangerous. So.
I wonder, and similarly, even if we're really, if Michael's right, and the Brits are really sensible, which I think we will be, you then risk that the next country to get out of the same route may not be. That's an incredibly Anglo-centric view of the world. That might be the most English thing I've ever said. But you see the point.
I think either way, it's going to be difficult. So you know, even if the UK stays in the EU, then obviously you have Euroscepticism and sort of far right anti-establishment parties gaining political legitimacy. So you know, I think that in a way, even if it's not going to be celebrated as a success, because the processes are already in the motion that are kind of disturbing sort of the traditional EU setting.
But we haven't mentioned NATO. I mean, you know, one of the things that's striking in the US election is that, you know, President Trump might be more isolationist. You know, the survival of NATO is not necessarily something that doesn't quite work on a year-on-year basis, right?
I cannot analyze Mr. Trump's foreign policy or security policy. I don't have the tools to do that. But you know, again, it speaks to the question of what America's role in the world will be in the future. We've had two very different models over the last 16 years. We have had one of great intervention and an enormous amount of consequences for those interventions. We've had an administration that has not intervened, and we've seen the consequences of a lack of intervention. And quite frankly, a profound questioning of, again, who's enforcing these wonderful international laws and norms that we all believe are super but require sacrifice.
Well, we could also have presidents who intervene even less than that. The Obama administration might not even be the extreme of non-intervention.
Absolutely. Right? So this is sort of the question. We're at a point where there's a crisis of confidence in Western leadership, institutions, economic models. We have challengers there. So you look at, you know, we all have practiced the phrase, you know, the NATO is the world's most successful military alliance in history, and, you know, brought to you by the U.S. taxpayer that provides 77% of NATO's budget. And Europe has enjoyed that enormous generosity for many years. And I think in some ways this has been a disturbing wake-up call when it comes to defending external borders and things like that, that Europe has allowed itself to believe that it was a post-modern state that did not need to do territorial defense, and has now woken to the nightmare that it may have to do territorial defense, and they're not sure if the U.S. is going to provide adequate protection to that. So this will either draw a new rethink in Europe, which I think the migration crisis is actually doing much more than Mr. Putin is doing, to create a defensive mechanism to defend borders, or it will not, and the U.S. has to decide whether it will continue to provide that security umbrella and guarantee, or it will have political leaders who say this will end and will defend our borders, and others will have to defend.
What would Europe look like if you removed that American umbrella?
Well, the United States, whether leading from behind or from in front, has been the crucial element in the resolving various conflicts in Europe, notably the former Yugoslavia. The Libya episode may or may not have been thought out, but in the absence of the United States, I don't think Europeans would have gone ahead.
And the minor issue of 2 world wars.
Yes, indeed. And now I think there's a big debate in this town and elsewhere about whether NATO has the will and the capacity to honor the Article 5 commitment. The Baltic states feel themselves to be very much under pressure, maybe a low probability risk that Putin decided to test NATO by actually intervening in the Baltic states, crossing the river in Narva or some such. But 2 major think tanks here produced a report over the course of the last month to the effect that NATO would lack the capacity to intervene and therefore to honor Article 5. And if this were to be the case, it would be the end of NATO.
Well, I mean, a lot of this is about, it's not about capacity, it's about will. Because, I mean, we have the capacity to make sure that a bunch of Brits and Americans get killed on the first day of a Russian invasion of the Baltics. And we then, you know, after that, Fox News would demand action, and I wouldn't bet the cards against nuclear war once 30 Americans are dead. So, you know, we have, the question is, but Putin will only try and take the Baltics if he thought he could do it without triggering those kind of consequences. So I wonder if, you know, this is where the strategic posturing gets important. I mean, if the belief in Russia is that you can take back 10 miles of the Baltics with no cost, I see no reason why they would not do so. If the conclusion is that you really, really can't, then I see no reason why they would. You know, and at the moment, by the sound of it, it's very confused. And this is pretty scary if you happen to live, you know, east of the Rhine, right?
You know, I think it's exactly right. It's more strategic than it is about, you know, are we actually able to defend the Baltic states? Because, you know, frankly, if you read the assessments, perhaps we are not. But I think, you know, just so we are not just all negative here, I actually do think that NATO did a very good job since the crisis started. I mean, obviously, they could have been more forceful in Wales. But since then, most of the countries have stalled their declines in their defense budgets, and I think that now we're getting to the point, and especially with the United States putting additional $3 billion into the European Reassurance Initiative, which is very important on the U.S. side. So I actually do feel like that now, in this confluence of crises, Europe and European Union is facing. Actually, what NATO is doing right now, it's working and it has worked. And what I worry about, it's not necessarily Russians attacking the Baltic states. It's more sort of the under the threshold of Article 5 operations, whether it's sort of the hybrid warfare, whether it's incursions in sort of the Baltic Sea or in the Black Sea with Romania. And those are the issues NATO is considering right now. And NATO has taken steps to sort of help defend to these emerging threats as well. And also EU needs to step up too, because part of it is that sort of self-power approach where sort of intelligence gathering is the key as well, and almost how to prevent this ideological exploitation from Russia. How do you actually say? I think
which has been key to exploit the migrant crisis, right?
Absolutely. So I think that is almost the more dangerous thing, that actually are we able to deploy defense capabilities or troops in the Baltic border? So
I mean, NATO has never been based on the idea that you can eventually stopped a Russian assault. Right? It's been on proving the political will that you would end the world once they went past a certain number of German towns.
But you know, this is where what's unsettling about this period of time is that we did have clear rules during the Cold War. Those rules were respected. Those rules are no longer respected. And part of that is to create a coercive, fear-induced environment where nuclear saber rattling and exercising of tactical nuclear weapons and threatening nuclear posturing, that is to make us to take a step back, and it's to cause our allies to be not sure of the commitment. So those rules have changed.
And the
Russians have to get the Russians back to those original rules where we don't misinterpret each other, we don't have an accident, we don't have misunderstanding.
I mean, the Russians would argue that the America broke the rules first by 88, but the point is that the rules are now in flux, right? You need to get back to the stage where actually people know where they are. We already have, in a way that we rarely had in the Cold War, U.S. and Russian troops in the same country where there's a real war going on in Ukraine, also now Syria. I mean, how does Syria fit into this? Because it's almost a European conflict that's not in Europe.
So my reflection for all of us that were focusing on Ukraine, I think the defense and the security community here was a little torn. Some saw this as a very, this was a very important threshold that, Russia had to be taken very seriously. I think the other part of the community was skeptical. But after Russia intervened in Syria, and we've been really witnessing quite a bit of significant capability. Actually, now I think the entire defense, intelligence, security community, you see this congressional testimony over and over again. They now understand that Russia is, that's why they are the threat. They're showing us an enormous range of capability, and they are more than willing to use military means to pursue their political objectives. And the West is signaling, military options are off the table, negotiate. So we're sending very different signals. So what that demonstrates to us is that they are capable, ready, they are willing to take the costs of doing so, whether that's sanctions. There haven't really been costs with their behavior in Syria. So now the question is there going to be another event? Is part of this muscularity externally to try to keep attention focused on the enemies that surround Russia and are trying to keep it down to mask a weakening economy? Does that require more external aggression, adventurism? And if so, is the West, NATO, ready for that action? And that's really the question I think that NATO is going to have to respond to at its upcoming Warsaw Summit in July, because it's really about preparing NATO for the future, not just looking at the past and then the incursion in Ukraine. And these are very unsettling questions. We don't know, and Mr. Putin has a first mover advantage. We seem very reactive to his moves, and that's what has our Baltic friends so concerned, because something that's done very quickly and then military means are designed to sue for peace, that's your worst nightmare. That's why NATO is working on rapid mobilization. We'll never have the conventional capabilities that Russia has so close to NATO's borders in the east, but we do need to, as you said, make sure we have very strong deterrence measures that they understand the cost imposition of crossing into NATO territory would be extremely high. That's why no one should be considered.
I'm just going to open this up for questions quickly. We'll wrap up very quickly, but you can just say who you are.
Yeah, I'm Kate Lavender. I'm a graduate student at Johns Hopkins and also a reporter for the Cyber Brief. I wanted to touch on 2 points that you made, Heather. First, in the beginning, you quoted Jean Monnet saying crisis is how Europe will evolve, and then you was concerned about that. And then you also, when talking about the Brexit, talked about this referendum-itis that is almost in a way curing a democratic deficiency in Europe. So I'm wondering what all 3 of your thoughts are on this idea that maybe all of these various crises in Europe will actually in the future make European unity much stronger than it is currently.
It's a great question, because Monnet's vision, and this again, the concept of a European Union was built out of the ashes of 2 destructive wars where, democracy brought forth Adolf Hitler and unleashed terrible things. So in some ways, people couldn't be trusted. That's why institutions and technocrats were so important to the development of European institutions. In some way, those decisions were meant to be taken because there was a concern that the people could not be fully trusted, and they could be, nationalism and xenophobia and other fears could rise to the top. The problem is, I think in the 21st century, that left Brussels feeling very distant and very void from people. And then I think the economic crisis was just devastating to confidence that, Europe had really, from enlargement, expanded. It was a prosperity union. It redistributed wealth through different mechanisms, the common agricultural policy, the social and regional cohesion funds. But when it turned into an austerity union, the politics just went into reverse. And in some ways, I think the technocrats could not adjust to that, where there was such a strong backlash. So now we have sort of the revenge of the referendums. We saw that in 2005 when the European Constitution was negated in France and in the Netherlands, Ireland twice. And so the more you ask the people, the more they were saying no to this vision that was being created by European leaders and bureaucrats. And so slowly over time, it's getting easier to say no to Europe in many different ways. And I think this is where either this is somehow, Europe can be allowed to not fail, but to take a step off of its current trajectory, to allow people to support it and feel like they're part of it. But I feel the European leaders keep saying more Europe, and Europeans keep saying, I don't want that, I don't want that. And that's starting to come really to a head. And in some ways, the UK referendum was sort of that ultimate expression. So it may fix it, it may fray it, it may be that 28 countries simply cannot agree on a shared vision. And that's what I found so interesting. A few weeks ago, there was a meeting celebrating the anniversary, my anniversary festival, of the Treaty of Rome, which next year's anniversary. And in some ways, the founding 6 countries were like, boy, wasn't it easier when the 6 of us could agree on everything. I think in some ways, there's some deconstruction thinking going on to say, we can't exist in 28. Maybe we have to break it down a little bit, rebuild it, make sure we all agree and we'll follow the rules, and then come out with something else. Now that would be a very different model than what we're seeing, but it could be one potentially.
Well, there is this nostalgia on occasions, and then you have to remind people
the reality
that when we were only 6, or they were only 6, that's when there was the 6-month crisis of the empty chair, with General de Gaulle boycotting the institutions
so
until he got his way. That's when you had the Dutch lobbying for a transport union to help their transport.
De Gaulle blocking the UK coming in.
Absolutely, these were the good old days before enlargement. And then the original sin was allowing in the UK. And from that moment onwards, everything was downhill. I mean, this is a sort of golden age mythology, I think. It doesn't really hold up to much scrutiny. The fact of the matter is that the geopolitical setting of the EU has changed since those days. And maybe it made sense in Monnet's day, just after the Second World War, when the preoccupation was reconciliation between France and Germany, creating conditions where Germany could be rearmed without alarming countries that recently had been at war with Germany. Then you had the High Cold War with the EU really backing up NATO objectively in the Cold War. Then you had the collapse of communism, unification of Germany, enlargement. You had this whole geopolitical context that made that kind of prediction that crisis can lead to steps forward credible. That's all changed now. And I think from the moment when Helmut Kohl ceased to be Chancellor, Schröder took over, he had a completely different view of German interests. And Mrs. Merkel, while a supporter of the European Union, regards it as quite legitimate to act in the name of German national interests in a way that previous chancellors did not. And also to look to the global level as much as to the EU level. So I think many things have changed in the geopolitical context, which means that this rather comforting notion that, out of crisis, a sort of phoenix can rise in a new stage of European integration, to be rather over-optimistic.
I would just add that, I agree with everything my colleagues just said. I would just add that it's all about setting a positive agenda and identifying what is the new glue that is going to put Europe together again. And I think it might need to be that we just agree that some countries see some things differently and we're not going to agree on everything. But I feel like if you can just sort of identify the positive agenda for the European Union to move forward, and I think it actually applies on the economy. I think that's the key. Restore growth, restore competitiveness, create jobs, and give young people a reason to stay and benefit at Europe, which is why I think precisely this sort of new agenda. How do you actually create more innovation in Europe? How do you actually support entrepreneurship? How do you actually allow them to have impact that can create jobs in the region, and that can attract young people too, that they're not trying to find alternatives in the far right, but they have a different alternative to support. So my instinct is, give them something to support and something they can benefit from.
I'm going to take just a couple of very quick questions. We're going to go very quick answers and we'll wrap up. At the back.
Hi, Fanny Delago from the Economic Service at the French Embassy. You mentioned the place of the EU in the world. I was wondering, what is the US perspective on increasing economic Chinese influence in Europe? We've seen that through growing Chinese investment in the UK and the whole debate on the status of the market economy status. What is the US perspective?
I'm just going to take a couple of rounds.
Sure.
Yourself.
Market Thomas, Professor, University of Vermont. I want to ask about the potential future of the US-EU economic relationship. Are the fractures and frictions you guys have mentioned today, is it likely to have an impact, a waxing and waning impact on the transatlantic negotiations in the future from the side of the US? Is the US less likely to be interested in furthering the depth of negotiation, given that on the mainland, few countries can agree on many of the things the US wants standardization on?
I'm going to take one more question. Yourself.
Yeah, Ken Meyer, or this TV show called World Docs. Are there pro-Russian factions in any of the Baltic states who, if they came to power through peaceable means, might voluntarily withdraw their countries from NATO?
Good. All good questions. Where do you want to start?
Well, I'll just touch very quickly. China is certainly investing in Europe as it is in the US. This is where I sort of come back to the US and the EU need to invest in rules that enshrine our values and our norms. And we can do that separately, or we can do that together. And what we want to do is we want to allow China to grow responsibly within that normative framework. But when countries place economic interest over that normative value system, that reduces that normative framework. So we obviously have the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which is our rules-based framework for trade. The EU has a bilateral relationship. Individual countries have their own bilateral relationship with China. We found where, in the instance of the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, we did not have an agreement. And there's lots of reasons on this side why that was a problem. But we have to make sure that we press those rules, because if they're not our rules, they're going to be very different rules and they'll disadvantage our system. So that relationship is very important. And the EU, Europe, needs to also understand, this goes back to my security free riding concern. US Navy protects $5 trillion worth of trade that goes through the Asia Pacific region. The EU should be just as concerned about maritime disputes and having them resolved in international legal norms as does the US. And so it would be great if our European colleagues would find their voice on that particular issue. TTIP, you're absolutely right. We've sort of lost the strategic thread. And we're negotiating, but we're losing our audiences, which again sort of harkens back to the, we can be right up here, but if you don't have public support, if it is true that they will finish the negotiation this year, hooray, but it's not going to get anything done before the French and German elections in 2017. It will be reopened by a new administration regardless. So we've got a lot of work to do. And on the pro-Russian factions, at this point in the Baltic states, pro-Russian factions have been, in some ways, have helped embolden or strengthen more Western parties in the Baltic states. They've really worked very hard to keep them out. I think the Baltic states have a stronger appreciation for how Russian influence works in their countries through media, through the political party financing and the economics. They're still vulnerable, but I think there's a growing awareness. I worry about countries that are not aware of how Russian influence works in their countries, and where we saw the information operations campaign in Germany over the migrant crisis, whether we see where Russia's strongly challenging democratic societies, using democratic rules and institutions in our own countries, using that influence. So we have a big project on Russian influence right now, and it's something I feel very strongly that we're not as aware as we should be about how this influence works.
You might want to make some comparative studies with American influence in Canada.
Very good. Thank you very much.
Michael.
Just to address briefly the transatlantic relationship, I think the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership is an extremely ambitious vision, and it's really regrettable that no one has been ready to risk any political capital on either side of the Atlantic to support this project. And we know what the obstacles are, and whether in public opinion, whether in Congress, ISDS. The problems are considerable, but they could be overcome. So if Heather is right and it goes onto the back burner until 2017, at that point, I think it's very important that the new administration and Congress and whoever's in charge in Paris, Berlin at that time, and Britain hopefully having confirmed its place in the European Union as a free trading country. And given that multilateral steps really towards trade liberalization and investment provisions can't really be expected, give this a new chance. Because it's really the only major project on the horizon for Europe that could stimulate growth and jobs. And simply accepting that the negotiators are doing their job, but politically, of course, we shrug our shoulders, just not possible. I don't think we can take no for an answer in the medium term.
Just in the Russian, sort of pro-Russian factions in the Baltics, I was recently at a dinner with Estonian foreign minister, and I was very pleased. She's of Russian origin, decent herself, and I was just very pleased to hear when she goes talk to the region and talk to the communities, and they feel so strongly pro-Western, and so they don't have in Estonia any problem with sort of Russian minorities or people who have sort of Russian origin to sympathize with Russian or start, a type of rebellion. That Lithuania is a different example, but I feel like that this crisis has actually made all of them acutely aware of the threats, and they see the standard of living they have in these countries that is definitely more prosperous for them, as opposed to leaning towards Russia. So now I'm not saying that everything what Heather is saying and what I said I've been mentioning on Russia sort of exploiting the trying to impose different values on some of these countries in Central and Eastern Europe. That is a serious threat, and it should not be taken lightly. But I think that Baltic states right now are in a good shape.
I'm gonna wrap up here, but I mean one point on that point on the Baltics. I mean, a lot of politics is local. I mean, at the end of the day, you're talking about populations that make up 15, 20% is possibly the largest population of the Baltic states. It's all in the event. If you have an overly securitized response that makes Russians in the Baltic states feel that they are not part of the Baltic states, they'll be safer under Russia, then we're basically screwed. And by the same token, if they feel they have more to gain from being EU and NATO citizens, assuming that both of them survive, then they probably won't want to leave. It really depends on what's going on. I covered the outbreak of Islam before, so I've seen quite a lot where you've got Tamil foreigners there as well. Then someone shot him. You can start to take away that grey area in the middle and polarize things. And if you're looking for where Europe might go wrong, it's about sort of 10 miles wide. You could open up some pretty bad problems there, and by the same token, we could make them a hell of a lot worse by doing the wrong thing. Thank you very much indeed. We've been PS21. Thank you to Reuters for hosting us. Thank you for a really excellent panel. We'll be back on Tuesday evening at 6 p.m. talking about how the US election matters or doesn't matter for foreign policy with Julia Clark from Ipsos Mori, Nicholas Costa from the US Naval War College, Alex Ward from the Atlantic Council, and probably somebody else, and myself. Thank you very much indeed, and have a good afternoon. Take care.